She was the most dangerous weapon in the bar, but the drunk Marine saw only a woman alone. He didn't know that his assault would trigger a chain of events exposing a viral scandal, a dead soldier's ghost, and a father's secret legacy. The fog rolled off the Pacific like a heavy, wet blanket, possessing a physical weight that seemed to press down upon the crumbling coastline of Oceanside. "Women like you get good men killed out here." The voice was slurred, heavy with the specific aggressive cadence of whiskey and unearned arrogance. It slammed into her solitude like a physical blow, disrupting the delicate equilibrium she had maintained for the last hour. Thalia didn't flinch. She didn't even look up immediately. She took a slow breath, inhaling the scent of the intruder, cheap cologne, stale tobacco, and the sour, fermented tang of ethanol. She knew the type before she saw him. She knew the shifting of weight on the balls of the feet, the performative masculinity required when an audience was present. She watched the reflection in the mirror behind the rows of backlit bottles. Corporal Jason Devo. She knew his name not because they had met, but because she made it her business to know the threat environment, even in a bar on a Tuesday night. He was big, 6'2" of gym-sculpted muscle that looked more aesthetic than functional, wearing a tight Marine Corps t-shirt that screamed of a deployment he likely spent inside the wire, lifting weights and complaining about the chow. Devo leaned in, violating her personal space. His breath was hot and wet against her neck, carrying the stench of decay. "I'm talking to you, sweetheart. You look lost. Maybe you need a Marine to show you where you belong." A ripple of laughter erupted from a booth behind him. His pack. 3 other Marines, emboldened by the alcohol and the herd mentality, watched with predatory amusement. They were younger, leaner, their eyes darting between Devo and the woman, waiting for the show. Thalia finally turned her stool slowly, the metal swivel groaning in the quiet interval between songs on the jukebox. Her green eyes were flat, devoid of fear, dull polished stones that reflected nothing. Devo, in his inebriated state, mistook this lack of reaction for submission. He saw the flicker of uncertainty in his own reflection, but he was too committed to the bit now to back down. "I'm asking you once," Thalia said, her voice low, a calm vibration that seemed to cut under the noise of the room rather than compete with it. "Step back, Corporal." The use of his rank should have been a warning. It was a precise identification, a signal that she saw him not as a man, but as a subordinate service member. It implied a hierarchy that he was currently violating. But Devo missed it. His ego, fragile as spun glass and held together by liquid courage, cracked. He slammed a hand onto the bar next to her drink, rattling the ice and causing a splash of whiskey to jump onto her sleeve. "You don't give orders here, Faye," he spat, flecks of saliva hitting her cheek. "You're just some officer's wife looking for a thrill. You think because you sleep with the brass, you matter? Women in the ranks are a joke. A quota. My brother died because people like you couldn't pull their weight." That was the twist of the knife. The mention of a dead brother. It wasn't just misogyny. It was grief, weaponized into hate, sharpened into a shiv and thrust into the soft underbelly of the conversation. Thalia felt a phantom throb in her left forearm, where a jagged scar from a firefight in Helmand Province lay hidden beneath her jacket, a reminder that she had pulled plenty of weight and dragged plenty of bodies. She stood up. She was 5'7", giving up nearly 8 inches and 80 pounds to him. The bar went silent. The bartender, Eddie, a former corpsman with cauliflower ears and a nose that had been broken 3 times, reached for the bat under the counter. His hand froze. He saw Thalia's stance. Her feet were shoulder-width apart, rooted to the floorboards. Her hands were open, resting casually near her waistline, not fists, but blades. It was the stance of someone who wasn't preparing to fight, but preparing to end a fight. "Last warning," Thalia whispered. The air between them crackled with static electricity. Devo sneered, his face twisting into an ugly mask of contempt. He shoved her. It was a hard, clumsy push meant to humiliate, to knock her back into her seat like a child. It was the worst mistake of his life. Time seemed to dilate. For Thalia, the world slowed to a crawl. She saw the twitch of his pectoral muscle before the arm moved. She saw the shift in his center of gravity as he committed his weight forward. Gravity and physics became Thalia's allies, ancient friends she had conversed with for 20 years. As his hand made contact with her shoulder, she didn't resist. It was a living entity, a gray ghost that smothered the neon flicker of the Anchor and Anchor dive bar, turning the bright red tubes of gas into hazed, bleeding wounds against the night. The mist tasted of brine and diesel, the specific flavor of a Navy town after dark. She didn't brace. She rotated. She trapped his wrist with her left hand, her grip like a steel vise, and used his forward momentum against him. She stepped in, pivoting her hips with the grace of a dancer and the violence of a pile driver. It was a fluid, violent ballet. In less than 2 seconds, the 220-pound Marine was airborne. The arc of his body was almost beautiful until he slammed face first into the sticky floorboards. The sound was sickening, a wet slap of meat on wood followed by the sharp crack of air leaving lungs. The jukebox seemed to go mute. Before his friends could inhale, Thalia had his arm barred behind his back, hyperextending the shoulder joint just to the point of tearing. She dropped her knee into his kidney, pinning him with agonizing precision. "Stay down," she barked. The voice was no longer low. It was the command voice, the tone she used over comms during live fire raids, a frequency designed to cut through explosions and panic. The three friends surged forward, boots scuffling on the floor, ready to defend their alpha. Thalia's free hand whipped into her jacket pocket. She didn't draw a weapon. She drew her wallet, flipping it open with a snap of her wrist to reveal the gold foil of her military ID glinting under the bar lights. Commander Thalia Renwick, Naval Special Warfare Group 1. "Stand down, or I will have every one of you court-martialed before sunrise." The air left the room. The friends froze, boots skidding on the floor as if they had hit an invisible wall. The realization hit them like a mortar round. An O5, a commander, and not just any commander, Renwick. The name was royalty in the amphibious community. It carried weight, history, and a reputation for ruthlessness. Devo, groaning beneath her knee, went limp, the fight draining out of him as the horror of his reality set in. He wasn't fighting a civilian. He was assaulting a superior officer. Thalia held him there for 10 seconds longer than necessary, letting the shame saturate him, letting the pain in his shoulder sear the lesson into his neurons. Then she released him and stood, smoothing her jacket with trembling hands, not from fear, but from the adrenaline dump. "NCIS will be contacting your chain of command, Corporal," she said, her voice ice cold. "Get out of my sight." As the Marines scrambled out, dragging a stunned, bleeding Devo like a sack of laundry, Thalia noticed a phone held up in the corner booth. A civilian, mouth agape, was recording. The red light blinked like a malicious eye, a digital cyclops capturing her ruin. She felt a cold pit form in her stomach, heavier than the whiskey. She had won the fight, but the war had just escalated. By the time she reached her car, her hands were shaking uncontrollably. The fog outside was thicker now, obscuring the world. She sat in the driver's seat of her sedan, listening to the rhythm of the rain beginning to patter against the roof. She pulled her phone out. No missed calls from her father. Just a news alert from a military aggregation site. Video surfaces of bar fight near Camp Pendleton involving senior Navy officer. It had been 12 minutes. She drove home in a daze. Her house in Coronado was a sterile box of beige walls and rented furniture. She walked into the bathroom and scrubbed her hands until the skin was raw, trying to wash off the feeling of Devo's wrist, the smell of the bar, the sensation of violence. She stared at herself in the mirror. The woman staring back looked hollowed out. The fallout was swift, toxic, and utterly exhausting. By Monday morning, the video had 1 million views. The narrative was fractured, a perfect mirror of a divided culture. Half the internet cheered the badass female commander who took out the trash. The other half, the darker, slimier corners of the military blogosphere, tore her apart. They claimed she provoked him, that she was out of control, that this was proof women were too emotional for command, that she was an affirmative action hire gone rogue. Thalia sat in Captain Halloway's office in Coronado, the blinds drawn against the relentless California sun. The room smelled of stale coffee and recycled air conditioning. Holloway, a man whose career was built on risk aversion and carefully worded emails, paced behind his desk. "We're managing the optics, Thalia," Holloway said, avoiding her eyes. He stopped and adjusted a picture frame on his desk, a photo of a ship he hadn't set foot on in 5 years. "It's clear self-defense. The JAG agrees. But the Admiral—" He trailed off, letting the title hang in the air. Not her father. It was the kind of weather that seeped into your bones, bypassing fabric and skin to settle deep in the marrow, reminding you of old injuries. A twisted ankle from basic underwater demolition, a shrapnel graze from Kandahar, the ache of a rotator cuff worn down by years of pull-ups and recoil, and even older regrets. Commander Thalia Renwick sat at the far end of the scarred mahogany bar, a solitary figure carved from silence and shadows. The Admiral of Naval Special Warfare Command. They're concerned about judgment, about temperament. "You're up for promotion, Thalia. This is a blemish." "He put his hands on me, sir," Thalia said, sitting rigid in the uncomfortable chair. "I neutralized the threat. Would you have preferred I let him concuss me?" "I know," Holloway sighed, finally looking at her with tired bureaucratic eyes. "But you know how this works. Perception is reality. You humiliated a junior Marine in a public forum. The Brotherhood is rumbling. They say you baited him. They say you were looking for a fight to prove a point." Thalia felt the heat rise in her neck. "I existed in a bar, Captain. That was my provocation. Existing. I didn't ask to be a symbol. I just wanted a drink. Just lay low." Holloway waved a hand dismissively, signaling the end of the meeting. "Go home. Take a few days. Let the news cycle eat someone else." Thalia left the office, feeling the weight of the building pressing down on her. The corridors were filled with framed photos of men, bearded, tattooed, holding rifles. Heroes. She walked past them, feeling like an imposter in her own home. Instead of going back to her empty house, she drove to the small, non-denominational chapel on the base's edge. It was a place she hadn't visited since Bud S., since the days when the cold water and the sand chafing her skin made her question her sanity every single morning. She pushed open the heavy oak doors. The interior was dim, lit only by votive candles, and the sunlight filtering through stained glass that depicted sailors on stormy seas. The air was cool and still, smelling of beeswax, old paper, and the quiet desperation of 1,000 prayers. She wasn't a woman of performative piety. She had seen too much blood to believe that prayers stopped bullets. But the isolation of command was a heavy cross, and she needed a place to set it down. She slipped into the back pew, the wood hard and unforgiving. She pulled a small, worn St. Michael medallion from her pocket, the patron saint of warriors. It had belonged to her grandfather, a man who fought in the Pacific in a different war, a simpler war, where the enemy wore a uniform and the lines were drawn on a map. She rubbed the raised relief of the archangel standing over the dragon, the metal smooth against her thumb. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for this part," she whispered into the gloom. Her voice sounded small in the cavernous space. It wasn't the physical danger. She could handle bullets. She could handle the cold, the hunger, the fatigue. It was the constant need to be perfect, to never slip, to be the representative for an entire gender every time she walked into a room. If a man failed, he was just a failure. If Thalia failed, women failed. The burden was suffocating. She closed her eyes, letting the silence of the sanctuary wash over her. She replayed the fight in the bar. She felt the crunch of Devo's face hitting the floor, the satisfaction she had felt in that moment, the primal joy of hurting someone who wanted to hurt her, curdled into guilt. Was that leadership? Or was that vengeance? In that quiet, a strange clarity emerged. She realized that destroying Devo, ruining his career with a court-martial, stripping his rank, dishonoring him, would be the easy path. It was the expected path. It's what her father, the great Admiral James Renwick, would have done. Ruthless efficiency. Cut the cancer out. Show no weakness. But Thalia wasn't her father. She felt a nudge, a spiritual intuition that felt like a warm hand on her shoulder, cutting through the chill of the chapel. Mercy is a tactic, too. Mercy wasn't weakness. Mercy was control. The next morning, Thalia stunned the Judge Advocate General and Devo's battalion commander. The conference room was sterile, filled with men in crisp uniforms who had already decided Devo's fate. The paperwork was stacked high, a tombstone made of pulp. "I don't want a court-martial," she said, standing tall at the head of the table. The JAG officer blinked, his pen hovering over the charge sheet. "Commander, this is an assault on a superior officer. Article 90. It's cut and dry. We have the video. We have witnesses." "I want him for 2 weeks," Thalia said, ignoring the legal jargon. "Non-judicial punishment, reduction in rank to private first class, and a mandatory 2-week intensive mentorship program run personally by me." The room went silent. The battalion commander, a lieutenant colonel with a high and tight haircut and a neck as thick as a telephone pole, leaned forward. "You want to train the man who attacked you?" "Renwick, if he tries anything, if he fails, you can burn him," Thalia said, her voice steel. "But if I can fix him, we save a Marine. Isn't that the job? Or are we just in the business of discarding people?" The deal was struck. It was unprecedented. It was risky. The wood beneath her fingertips was worn smooth, polished by generations of elbows, spilled spirits, and the friction of 1,000 lies told by sailors trying to forget the sea. She was nursing a whiskey she had no intention of finishing. The amber liquid sat in the heavy glass, sweating condensation that trickled down like tears, pooling on the cocktail napkin in a slow, spreading stain. If Devo failed, or if he attacked her again, her career would be over. She would be the commander who couldn't assess a threat, the woman who was too soft for the hard decisions. The training was brutal. Thalia didn't haze him. Hazing was for children. She broke him down to build him up. She met him at 0400 every morning on the beach. The Pacific was black and freezing, the sand cold enough to numb the toes through boots. "Move, Devo. The enemy doesn't care if you're hungover." "The enemy doesn't care about your feelings," she screamed over the crash of the surf. She ran him through the soft sand berms of Coronado until he vomited bile into the surf. She made him carry logs that weighed as much as a man, struggling under the wet wood as it dug splinters into his shoulders. But she didn't just watch. She ran beside him. When he carried the log, she carried a rucksack filled with sand. She put him in the classroom, forcing him to study the tactical histories of female partisans in Wobby-Patu, Soviet snipers, French resistance fighters. She made him read their after-action reports, forcing him to intellectualize the value of the soldier regardless of biology. Devo remained sullen, a wall of resentful silence. He did the work, but his eyes burned with hatred. He saw this as torture, as her victory lap. He saw her as the embodiment of everything that had ruined his core. The twist came on the 4th day. It was raining, a torrential downpour that turned the trails near the base into slurry. They were miles out, covered in grime, breathing hard. The sky was a bruised purple, dumping water in sheets. Thalia stopped at the crest of a hill, turning to the panting private. Steam rose from their bodies, mixing with the rain. "Why the brother comment, Devo?" she asked, her voice cutting through the wind. "In the bar. You said your brother died because of women like me. Tell me. I want to know the ghost I'm fighting." Devo looked up, his eyes raw and red, water dripping from his nose. He wiped his face, smearing mud across his cheek. "Corporal Marcus Devo, Helmand Province, 2022. He spat the words out like poison. He called in air support. They were pinned down in a wadi, taking heavy fire from 3 sides. He got on the radio. The voice on the net, the Joint Terminal Attack Controller. It was a woman. She hesitated. He asked for the drop, and she hesitated. He took her round to the neck because she couldn't make the call. He bled out waiting for the bird. The world seemed to stop spinning. Thalia froze. The rain hammered against her hood, deafening, but she heard nothing but the ringing in her ears. 2022. Helmand, the Sangan Valley. Operation Red Wings 2. The memory hit her like a physical blow. The rain faded, replaced by the smell of ozone, stale sweat, and the hum of cooling fans. She was back in the Tactical Operations Center. The screens were flickering. The radio chatter was a cacophony of panicked voices. "Slayer 6, taking effective fire. Danger close. Need immediate suppression." She could hear the voice. She could see her own hand pressing the transmit button. She could feel the crushing weight of the interference. The Russian jammer on the ridgeline. The ghost signals dancing on the screen. "November Juliet, this is Slayer 6. Request immediate suppression. Danger close," she whispered the call sign in the rain. Devo's head snapped up. "How do you know that call sign?" "I was the battle captain," Thalia said, her voice hollow, trembling slightly. "I was in the TOC. I was monitoring the feed." She stepped closer to him. The distance between them wasn't rank anymore. It was the shared trauma of a specific Tuesday in Afghanistan. "It wasn't hesitation, Jason," Thalia said, her voice softening, dropping the command tone. "It was signal jamming. The Taliban had a Russian-made localized jammer on the ridgeline. We were getting ghost signals. Electronic warfare. The drone feed was compromised." Devo shook his head violently, stepping back, his boots squelching in the mud. "No. No," she stuttered. She stopped talking. "I heard the recording." "She stopped talking because she was trying to clear the frequency," Thalia insisted, her eyes locking onto his, pleading with him to understand the physics of war. "We had a drone overhead. The telemetry was scrambled. If that controller had cleared the drop 2 seconds earlier, the J-Dam would have guided on the strongest signal, which was your brother's radio. She didn't kill him, Devo. She saved the rest of his platoon. If she had dropped that bomb when he asked, everyone in that wadi would be dead. She held the release until the jammer cycled down." Devo stared at her, his chest heaving. The narrative he had built his grief around, the cornerstone of his anger, was crumbling. "You're lying." To the casual observer, and there were many in this enlisted haunt on the edge of the base, she was just a civilian woman, perhaps 35, with sharp avian features and eyes that looked as if they hadn't slept in a decade. They saw the loose gray jacket that swallowed her silhouette, the nondescript denim, the way her dark hair was pulled back in a severe utilitarian ponytail that pulled the skin tight around her temples. They didn't see that the Trident coin burning a hole in her pocket. "You're just covering for her. You officers always cover for each other." "I'm not," Thalia said. She reached into her waterproof pouch and pulled out her phone, tapping the screen with wet fingers to access her secure cloud drive, a violation of protocol she was willing to commit. She pulled up a declassified PDF, the after-action report. "Look at the signature on the bottom. That's my signature. And look at the appendix. Electronic countermeasures log. Read the timestamp." She shoved the phone at him. Devo took it, his hands trembling. He read the lines. The jammer detection, the timestamp matching the call for fire, the realization that the hesitation was a frantic, heroic effort to reboot the targeting system. "She saved 12 men that day," Thalia said gently. "Your brother died a hero, Jason. But he didn't die because of a woman's incompetence. He died because war is chaos. He died because the enemy gets a vote." That moment broke the dam. The rage that had fueled Devo's alcoholism, his bigotry, his bar fights, it all disintegrated, leaving just a grieving boy who missed his big brother. He dropped the phone into the mud and fell to his knees. A sound ripped from his throat, a guttural sob that had been trapped there for 2 years. Thalia didn't stand over him. She didn't lecture him on military bearing. She sat down in the mud, ruining her trousers, and sat with him. For an hour, while the rain washed away the sweat and the dirt, she offered the only thing she had, the truth, and the shared burden of survival. She told him about the decisions made in the air-conditioned rooms that determined who lived and died in the dirt. She humanized the voice on the radio. The final act of Devo's punishment was a presentation to his company. 2 weeks later, the auditorium was packed. The air was thick with the smell of floor wax and nervous energy. Thalia stood in the very back, hidden in the shadows of the overhang, invisible again. Devo took the podium. He looked different. The bloat of the alcohol was gone, replaced by a lean, hungry look. He was terrified, but resolute. He didn't just read a prepared statement written by a lawyer. He spoke. He told the truth about the jammer. He publicly dismantled the lie he had told himself. He spoke about the bar fight, not as a victim, but as an aggressor who had been rightfully checked. And then he spoke about Commander Renwick. "I thought she was the enemy," Devo said, his voice echoing in the silent hall. "I thought she represented everything wrong with the Corps. But when she had the power to destroy me, to end my life as a Marine, she chose to teach me instead. She showed me that strength isn't about who can hit the hardest. It's about who can carry the heaviest load." He looked up, searching the back of the room, though he couldn't see her in the darkness. "Commander Renwick saved my career, and she probably saved my life." The applause was hesitant at first, confused Marines unsure if they were allowed to clap for this vulnerability. Then it grew. It became thundering. The viral narrative began to shift. The headlines changed from bar fight to redemption. But for Thalia, the victory wasn't in the applause. It was in the lack of weight in her chest, yet the final ghost remained. The hardest briefing of her life was still ahead. Thalia drove to the airport that Friday. She flew to Virginia, renting a car and driving out to the sprawling estate overlooking the Chesapeake Bay. The landscape shifted from the brown, arid hills of California to the lush, humid green of the East Coast. The air here was thick, filled with the sound of cicadas buzzing in the trees and the heavy, sweet smell of honeysuckle. It was a softness that felt alien to her calloused skin. She pulled up the long gravel driveway. Her father sat on the porch, a tartan blanket over his legs despite the stifling heat, looking frailer than she had ever seen him. The stroke the previous year had taken more of him than he admitted in his brief clipped emails. He was a monument that was beginning to crumble, a mighty ship listing in the harbor. On the wicker table next to him was a tablet, paused on the video of Devo's speech. Thalia got out of the car. The gravel crunched loudly under her boots, announcing her arrival. She walked up the steps, her heart hammering against her ribs harder than it had in the bar fight. She felt 6 years old again, waiting for inspection. "You didn't court-martial him," Admiral James Renwick said. He didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the bay, on the gray destroyers moving slowly on the horizon like sharks. His voice was raspy, lacking the boom that used to command fleets and terrify ensigns. "No," Thalia said, stopping at the bottom of the steps. "I didn't." The metal was warmed by her body heat, a heavy brass reminder of the fraternity she belonged to but always stood slightly apart from. They didn't know about the Silver Star citation locked in her fireproof safe at home, the paper yellowing at the edges, the metal collecting dust in a velvet box she hadn't opened in 4 years. "I would have," he said. "I would have buried him. I would have made an example of him to show that discipline is absolute. I would have stripped him of his rank and sent him to Leavenworth." "I know," Thalia replied, bracing herself for the lecture. She prepared her defense, the psychological warfare aspect, the asset recovery, the leadership dynamic. She ran the bullet points in her head. The Admiral turned his head slowly. The movement was stiff, painful to watch. His eyes, usually hard as flint, gray and unforgiving, were wet. And I would have been wrong. The admission hung in the humid air like a thunderclap. Thalia felt her breath hitch. She gripped the railing, her knuckles turning white. "I watched the video, Thalia. I watched how you handled him in the bar. You didn't strike in anger. You struck to neutralize. You moved like water." He looked down at his trembling hands. "And then, you turned an enemy into an asset. That is the highest form of warfare. Sun Tzu wrote about it. I preached it, but I never mastered it. I was always a hammer looking for a nail." He reached under the blanket and pulled out a thick manuscript bound with rubber bands. "I wasn't writing a book on naval doctrine, Thalia. I told you I was, but I wasn't." He held it out to her. The hand shook violently. Thalia walked up the final steps and took the stack of papers. The title was handwritten in his jagged scrawl, "Letters to a Daughter I Underestimated." "I was afraid," he whispered, his voice breaking, cracking under the weight of a decade of silence. "When you joined, I wasn't angry because you were a woman. I was angry because I knew what the teams do to people. I knew the darkness. I knew the divorce rates, the suicides, the alcoholism. I wanted to protect you from it. And when you succeeded, when you got the Trident, I felt obsolete. My fear looked like arrogance, but it was just a father terrified of losing his little girl to the same monsters he fought. Thalia looked at the manuscript, her vision blurring. The wall between them, a fortress built of silence, misunderstandings, and the rigid expectations of military culture, finally collapsed. It didn't fall with a bang, but with a whisper. She sat beside him on the wicker love seat, not as a commander, but as a daughter. She placed the manuscript on the table and reached out, taking his hand. The skin was paper-thin, cold despite the Virginia heat, dappled with age spots. "You didn't lose me, Dad," she said, the tears finally spilling over, washing away the grime of the last week, the last decade. "I'm right here. And I'm pretty good at fighting the monsters." The Admiral squeezed her hand. It was a weak grip, lacking the crushing power of his prime, but it was steady. "I know you are, Commander. I know you are." Thalia stayed in Virginia for the weekend. They didn't talk about tactics. They didn't debrief operations. They talked about the garden. They talked about her mother, remembering how she used to sing in the kitchen. On Sunday, she went to church with him, kneeling beside him in the pew, finding a peace she hadn't known existed. When she returned to Coronado on Monday, the fog had lifted. The ocean sparkled under a clear, brilliant sun. She walked into the team room, the heavy oak door slamming shut behind her with a definitive thud. She looked around the room, the maps on the walls, the weapons in the racks, the men who looked to her for orders. She was Commander Thalia Renwick. She was a woman of faith. She was a warrior of distinction. And for the first time in her life, she didn't need to prove she belonged. She simply was. Nor did they know about the classified operational binder in the trunk of her sedan outside, buried under gym bags and jumper cables, containing the deployment schedules for 3 SEAL teams and the kill-capture lists for high-value targets in the Horn of Africa. Thalia preferred the invisibility. It was a cloak she wore more comfortably than her dress whites. In the high-octane, testosterone-saturated world of naval special warfare, she was never just Thalia. She was the Admiral's daughter. She was the experiment. She was the woman who had to run faster, shoot straighter, and bleed quieter just to be considered average. Every promotion was scrutinized, every commendation whispered about in the chow halls as a political maneuver, a diversity checkbox ticked by the brass in Washington. But here, amidst the smell of stale beer, lemon-scented floor wax, and the briny rot of the salt air, she could almost pretend she was normal. She ran a thumb over the wet glass, watching the distortion of the light through the whiskey, her mind drifting to the empty house in Coronado she avoided returning to. The silence there was too loud. It was a vacuum, sucking the air out of the room, filled with the echoes of a phone that never rang. Specifically, a call from Virginia that she'd been waiting for, in vain, for 6 months. Her father's silence was louder than any artillery barrage she had ever endured.